Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Today we are working on throws as an offensive tool, the timing related to this, as well as understanding one specific part of rhythm that comes up more and more as one ends up facing more aggressive characters.
I cannot lose this fight.
Because this game has so many throws, so many options for throw positioning, throws with different startup, different reach, your throws can be just as important as your strikes in terms of variation and understanding. If you're just used to pressing forward plus throw in most games, or back plus throw for defense, you might find yourself having to do a bit of extra work here to figure out what exactly you should be hitting. In offense, throws often fill a space that other buttons can't fill. Normally, your opponent wants you to try similar combos all the time so they can hold out of it, or put yourself so close that they can throw you. This is actually, however, avoidable. At slightly higher levels, you can completely get around this flow from your opponent's side by aiming specifically from the very start of your combo that your intention is to throw. And since, like any other situation, your opponent can't necessarily read this unless they know you, and it's still guessing even then, you can get something out of it. The difficulty physically is what happens if your combo hits. Sometimes you end up being unable to do much because you went for a throw that would not work due to, you know, the fairness of block and throw stun interactions. And then you find yourself unable to do anything because now you've left yourself relatively open to your opponent's action. The second thing you often need to do is recognize how much pushback has happened, either because your opponent did a different move than you expected or not. But here's one good way to think about it, if you're learning it piece at a time. In nearly every situation where your character hits a kick that could be followed by a punch, you can also throw. It's simple enough to remember. If you thought hitting a kick was a good idea, your opponent blocked that kick, and you thought after the kick, oh, I can hit a punch here, then you can probably throw.
Yes, this is the melody.
Some characters are better at this than others, but overall, that's what you need to know, and that will be the main focus of this lobby, which will be, as always, a US East Coast, technically an Atlantic Rim lobby. This is Loser Stays On. You will have to search for Loser Stays if you would like to join it. I think you have to specifically set it to that. But we won't mind if you join and it's somewhat laggy. It depends on how terrible it is, and most people are more affected by lag than we are, so expect that if you join and the lag is too much for you, then leave. But if you're finding it bearable, then we probably are too. We'll let you know, of course, because it can be inconsistent, especially when players are not playing on wired connections when they're using the Wi-Fi for the purpose. But we're gonna more or less believe in it for now. A lot of this game is about sensing where your opponent's next open point is going to be when you're striking. But because if you're wrong or they happen to guard there, one of two things will happen. Either you will be blocked or you will whiff, You can learn over time to respond to those two things. If you whiff, most of the time you just want to defend and hope your opponent doesn't do certain things. They might try to throw you, but putting yourself in a defensive mindset means you're more likely to tech their throw. But if you're blocked, you'll want that moment to decide, should I throw here? Because that's almost always what should happen. If you were playing with serious intent, if you understood your character enough that you went for something in neutral, and you were blocked, normally you're not punishable by buttons. Or rather, if you play your character seriously enough, you generally learn when you hit a button that's definitely going to get you punished, as opposed to when you hit a button that your opponent should probably wait for you to hit another one, or would be going back to neutral. Those sort of little rhythms are learned over time by playing the game itself. But that is a good way to start off with it. So a good way to mentally connect this is simple. Was I surprised by what just happened? If you were surprised by what happened, normally you should block. And if you weren't surprised, often you should throw. And that's a good way to get you started even without actually thinking too much about anything else going on in the game. Surprises mean you should block,
Does it really hurt that much?
and anything else means you should throw. The only time this is different is when you are defending from an opponent's pressure string. If your opponent is hitting buttons intending to pressure you, they're either going to have a good idea of how to continue to be advantaged, which means you need to keep blocking. But in order for them to do that, they often have to use faster moves, and that often means you can hold them. Or they're going to stop at some point, and you will either get to throw, or they will try the throw and you will probably be able to tech. The way that frame data works in almost all of these games, though, is that if there's a delay, the person who was doing the thing that they planned to do has the advantage over the person who is trying to react to what's happening. And that's why I said at the beginning, you have an advantage if you go into a combo with the intention of throwing, because you can hit two buttons, wait just enough time for your opponent to begin recovery from your own, and go for the throw before they can realize that you aren't continuing the combo. This is definitely still a type of attack that can be teched, that the opponent can press throw in time to get out of being thrown, but it adds so much stress to them that it opens up other options. It's also a good way to make use of those attacks you have that don't really gain you a ton of advantage, but also don't knock your opponent down. Quick defensive pokes when your opponent has put themselves in a bad situation often don't lead to big damage, but sometimes they don't combo well either, meaning your opponent won't know what to do with themselves other than wait for you to finish the combo, often with something you probably shouldn't hit. Another good thing that throws help with is the tendency to prevent players from mashing quite as much. Most of us don't mash the throw button. And even if you do, you still have to change from what else you were doing to think about it. So it helps your brain get a small break from, I need to keep on attacking so that nothing bad happens to me. Just having the intent to use a throw can calm you a lot and prevent you from overcommitting to things or just hitting too many buttons.
Sorry I missed your lovely singing.
This ties back in directly to what to do when you are actually being pressured. Any given opposing player is only able to put on pressure for as long as you don't know what hold to use. Because there is basically no situation in which you can be blocking and your opponent use a full pressure option that can't be held. This means that if you are blocking your opponent at close range, you only ever really need to understand how to do two things. Throw because you think they're going to stop hitting buttons, or hold because you think they're going to keep hitting buttons. The hold part can be harder because you don't know which buttons they're going to hit, but at the core of the guessing game, let's say, that's all you need to know how to do. If you have started to block, the moment you feel, oh wait, I'm slow, this is they're gonna stop attacking, but I'm not gonna be ready to do this. I can't hold because they'll be too fast and I won't finish the combo, whatever. Any of those feelings, hit throw. Unfortunately, this is relatively easy because the timing this matters is almost always related to you blocking. Once again, we bring up that this is mainly because throws are quite fast relative to even regular attacks, meaning that if you're thinking to yourself, oh, my opponent's done attacking, I don't know if I can attack yet, but I should do something. The something you should do is almost always throw. Your faster buttons are probably slower than your throw. If you felt my throw isn't going to reach, they're too far, then probably your faster buttons weren't going to reach either, and you were going to get baited into something anyway. So, yeah, throw. This is particularly useful if you don't know what to hold in a situation. Which seems a little backward. Your opponent should just keep on hitting buttons for as long as you don't know what to hold. But a lot of the time, if you don't know what to hold, you could just keep blocking. And the fact that you can just keep blocking tends to be frustrating and cause your opponent to go for some slower option to break your guard, take you by surprise, or they'll go for some throw of their own. And often, at least being on the mindset of, okay, I should probably throw soon, makes it easier to be ready with the throw button when you need to tech. All of this helps to lower the stress you're facing during the rest of the match, so you can focus on the footsies as much as you want. You're probably going to block as a relatively natural thing in certain spaces anyway, so you don't need to care that much. If you fought any of our bots, you also know that that feeling of, oh, my throw isn't going to reach, usually means that your opponent is far enough out that they're going to try for some move that will reach from their side. But this usually means that their options are limited. They have to use slower moves, they have to use more predictable moves. The number of moves that they can use after pushing you really far out with blocking is smaller. Timer scams do not work that way in this game. But, as noted, one of the things that bots are meant to teach you, the earliest ones, the ones we have actually released, are how to put yourself at positions where you have a decent idea of what buttons your opponent must use as their options. No one is going to stand so far out that they're going to whiff with their punches and then still just do it. If they do this, they are definitely committing to trying to trick you, but they're also putting themselves at serious risk because you could usually build up a lot of responses, and a lot of those responses you build up are much, much more damaging than if they tried for the button and got held. So to them, it's usually best to take the risk of being held for the chance of more damage, whereas for you as the player in that situation, you should therefore be expecting to need to hold. And just in time, we are given a character who really embodies this little rule of flow, because Marie Rose has only a few moves that are not obvious when she's close, when she's farther away, and will try to keep going basically forever once she's close to you. Understanding how to hold this character, we've discussed before, not easy. She has a lot of different ways, and she tends to have advanced holds of her own, which makes hitting back even harder.
I'll fight you, Miss Helena.
I don't have time to play games with you.
I have no idea if this is going to be one of those people. But let's hit him and see. I think it might have just been AFK a little bit. Or something. Fortunately for this, it means that Marie Rose is a character that's relatively easy to outrange. Unless she gets it right to begin with, you don't get to do much of anything. Well, she doesn't get to do much of anything, and you only have to move out of the way. Side steps work well, slight back steps also work well, but you have to be ready to whiff punish a lot. And you can't commit too hard to retreating, or you'll get out of range of your own stuff. But the same things apply more or less. Trust that this character doesn't have a whole lot of options for dealing with you after she's done a move. And her trickier moves, as one of them was just demonstrated, don't often do a lot of damage, meaning you don't really care. She's also one of those characters who's easily defeated by walking around her in order to get in, rather than walking directly at her. Yep, definitely one of those players who basically is understanding that this is loser stays on, but wants to play longer, so unless you can keep up with them, they're definitely going to give you a lot of openings. We'll see what happens later on if they stick around. It's actually fairly hard for players at the beginning of understanding of this game to be calm enough to just whiff punish. This is basically true across all fighting games.
Even the smallest of
As soon as most of us face a character where your primary way of dealing with them is to whiff punish them, we end up second guessing whether or not the timing we have is right. Because obviously if your timing is wrong, you get hit worse, you feel weird, and so on. Unfortunately, this can't really be learnt unless you try. And even when you learn it, the timing still doesn't work that well necessarily. It does help somewhat to know your character's whiff punish options. But what's more likely to happen to most people is that we'll learn the stronger moves we have and learn the timings at which those moves work as whiff punishes, which is a completely different thing. Unfortunately, it is also the easier thing to learn, and it often feels like the more rewarding thing, especially since whiff punishes with short stuff require you to also hit confirm, meaning you can feel pretty messed up when you realize what was going on, hit the button, but in this game, for example, mashed too much and got the wrong combo, or didn't mash enough in time and therefore still got the wrong combo. But it looks like they won't stick around this time. probably next week we'll talk about the fact that holds in neutral are technically only ever whiff punished as a useful thing to add to your repertoire of stuff to do. But for this week, we already have enough on our plate, so hopefully I'll just remember to go into that next week. This game has a really high requirement on player intent.
Does it really hurt that much?
It is probably the least truly mashy of 3D games at the moment, I believe. Soul Calibur had some chance of being that, but then they added certain characters that just got to hit all the buttons. And while I was very thankful for Graw, it's not necessarily a push in that direction. Wolf is playing Mila sometimes this time around as well. Mila is a good character to learn this sort of thing on because she really embodies that feeling. If Mila is close, you really are down to hold or throw. She attacks quickly, she attacks in relatively obvious ways most of the time. She does nearly no damage if you block correctly and doesn't have a lot of great lows. She's basically counting on you blocking too long and getting thrown, or challenging at the wrong time and getting counter hit and let's call it frame trapped. It's not quite frame trapping, but it's very, very similar. The overall flow would therefore be to try to keep Mila at maximum range if possible, but if you've messed up in some way, and you end up blocking, that's your position. You either hold or throw. And there's no easy way to know which one to do because obviously it depends on both the player and the overall flow of the matchup at the moment. One can count on the fact that she often needs to get quite close for anything useful to happen on her side though. As with any character who basically must approach, you get a lot of time to make her life fairly miserable, and more importantly, you get to block at certain spaces because your opponent is usually thinking more so about how do I get in close and start hitting buttons, which means that once they get the chance to, they probably will start hitting buttons. This leads to a relatively easy choice in neutral. If you are able to stay out of Mila's range and keep on hitting her, good. As soon as she's gotten close and you don't think so, you don't really have to check this character as much as you have to check other characters. Just the psychology alone is more likely to make it so that your opponent is going to get in and start punching you, instead of going for anything particularly tricky. Her relatively slower and weaker kicks and similar also mean she's fairly easy to whiff punish when you've gotten used to her. They stay out for a long time, are generally at the height where they're easy to punch, especially with one of those swinging style punches that you're seeing here from Ayane. And this is a fairly large limit on how effective she is in neutral. Because a character that kicks you without advancing themselves doesn't even get a benefit off of throwing out kicks while they think you're going to be blocking. Fortunately, she does have a couple advancing kicks. It's just that they're just barely reactable on top of all that.
Don't make me laugh.
Mila players will probably complain about the fact that she has these incredibly reactable telegraphed kicks. But at this level of play, it's not necessarily so easily seen or so easily felt as if it's telegraphed. Just know that given enough time, you will in fact get used to this, since she only basically has 3 and they're fairly obvious. As always, we're concerned because we almost always have these little weird hiccups with this stream, specifically with the lounges. But there's never any way to tell when it's going to happen, why, or precisely how to fix it. We have often tried restarting the lounge, sometimes restarting the game. Usually restarting the game will help, but it's not clear why, and sometimes not even that is enough. If we do fall, the stream will probably come back up. Today is not a day where we're expecting to have any issues with connections, and it's been going fairly long so far without any hiccups, meaning that if another one does come along, it's probably not going to be that bad.
I don't have time to play games with you.
Yeah, I'm here to fight.
Helena has a similar ability to deal with Mila because she also has a lot of swinging punches that whiff punish things easily. Unfortunately, she also has much more negative kicks for neutral and less spinning with the kick part relative to Ayane, who gets to shift herself around in space a lot without necessarily being obvious about her position. Mila really deals well with characters who she knows the required range for, since she has so many precisely aimed normals. This goes exactly this far, this goes exactly this far, this whiff punishes at exactly this distance. All of these things are super important to this character. So, as it goes, Helena is a little disadvantaged in that she's not quite as misleading as other characters are, and therefore ends up getting whiff punished a lot. She can resolve this by spending much more time in her open stance, her down stance, and going for lows more often, as most of them, Mila doesn't have a lot of really good responses to lows that she doesn't have to commit to from the beginning. Her fastest buttons almost all strike at the head, and the ones that don't tend to get beat out by the punches anyway. You see that big swinging, for example. But the rule still applies. Once you've gotten close, you need to block, simply because you have to deal with too much of Mila's stuff otherwise. The thing that's most likely going to cause Kansuki Dynasty Siren problems here is her tendency to hit buttons to get out of block situations, because Mila does not have to respect any of this ever. Once she has caused you to start blocking, she is close enough for her fast punches to work. Fortunately, there is a simple solution. Don't ever let her get that close and the problem will be resolved. This is balanced by the general predictability of those punches and kicks at that close range. So she is either choosing between getting to continue her pressure and not getting held. Which is why you get the advice, hold or throw. At the very beginning, of course, you can keep blocking simply because you're not familiar enough with the character strings. Maybe if you realize that your holds are really not working and you're confused as to why, you might want to block and see more specifically what attacks you're being hit by. Possibly to verify that you are doing the hold correctly. And possibly just to figure out if something has gone weird in your flow as generality. But the core gameplay loop of the Mila matchup at this level remains the same. Keep her out if you can, and when you can't, block until you're comfortable either doing a hold or a throw.
Giving this all I got. Hey, no hard feelings. I won't lose.
Get ready. Get ready. Fight!
Let's go. We're out.
Get ready. Fight!
Here we go. Let's go.
Winner!
Promise me you won't tell anyone.
I don't have time to play games with you.
This is your last chance to run away.
Get ready. Fight! Get ready. Fight! Get ready. Fight!
On previous streams, we have talked a little bit about what was likely to happen once our Ayane player got used to both a certain aspect of her rhythm in terms of the acrobatic nature of her punches and spacing for lows, although that one was mentioned a little bit less. Well, you're seeing the results of that now.
Get ready.
These options open up spacings for Ayane to take advantage of that many other characters can do very little about. She has to commit fairly heavily, but if the opponent chooses to do anything strange within that space of time, she is almost always going to win. since almost all of these moves combo into things, and even though they don't necessarily combo into different things, so you could technically learn to always hold them, she can definitely vary some specific timings. So if you get too used to the idea of just, okay, I'm about to hold this right now, she still has ways through your defenses. This can in fact be frustrating on both sides if the skill gaps are a little too high, because you get the type of player who can never hold or never respond to this, and the type of player who has trained enough to do so nearly every time, as long as the most obvious or most effective routes are used. But as our Ayane player is also an Akuma player and has to deal with all of this every time a demon flip happens, you can expect that the emotional evolution required will probably happen a little bit faster on their side than for anyone going up against Ayane, which means we're all going to end up having to train on how to high hold certain kicks. Without just, okay, I've seen this move, count 40 frames and then do it. No one actually counts 40 frames, obviously, but your brain does build up this ability to tie a timing with an action, otherwise these games would be impossible. And the original premise that combos won't happen, no one can ever do that consistently, would have been right. It's not right, obviously, and therefore, same thing applies here. Just being used against you on your defenses rather than benefiting you in terms of your combos. And therefore, in terms of advances likely to be made by players, that moves us on to Helena and sidestep, sidestep, sidestep.
I cannot lose this fight.
Helena does not have a particularly great sidestep, however she does have a lot of really good misleading attacks from sidestep that continue to look like she's sidestepping, which is one of the most disorienting things in this game, really. Basically, as long as the character is sidestepping at all, and you're watching her feet, you cannot tell whether or not she's starting an attack or circling around you. Like, literally can't tell. There are definitely things in games where people tell you, man, those look the same. But, you know, an expert will be able to tell you after a while, no, those don't. No, for Helena they actually look exactly the same, because that's the animation requirement. The result of this is that as long as Helena is playing any form of neutral, her only concern generally is, are you going to hit me while I'm sidestepping? And this is further compounded by the fact that so many of her moves are side evasive. Specifically, that if you try to hit her with straight buttons, a good portion of her moves just avoid those buttons, especially if she was already sidestepping. Because the game does not force your character to stop sidestep before starting the move, it means she can do certain things out of sidestep that other characters just can't do. To the point where, definitely at this level, I would tell a Helena player that there's literally no reason to ever not be sidestepping, unless you think your opponent is going to attack. If you are in neutral and standing still, you don't need to be standing still, basically. There is no need to do it, no reason to ever do it, because it doesn't benefit you. This is also why she is one of those characters that tends to make most use of the special inputs for sidestepping. You can sidestep by using up and S, down and S, those are small ones. I believe there's also hold the hold button and move around, and then release it to stop, but I don't remember if that's still in this game. This has the additional use of also automatically blocking for you when you stop moving. But again, that's why I don't remember if it's in this game. So Helena players often have an entirely different way of holding the controller, moving around, playing the game than the rest of us. Now this isn't necessarily weird for any character. Sidestep is relatively strong in these games. It's just that you have to be fairly committed to it, and your opponent has to be fairly committed to using moves that don't do sweeping attacks in order for this to help directly. But it does help on characters that don't need a lot of forward taps in their movement, which is a big deal. For many characters, the reason why we can't just sidestep all the time is because a lot of good offensive moves require you to hold, tap, press the forward on the stick long enough that you have to stop sidestepping to do it, and if your opponent reads you in that moment, you're in trouble. Helena doesn't have this problem. Most of the moves she wants to use in those situations are either back, down, or up on the stick or the D-pad, and she doesn't care about that particular aspect of it. She transitions from sidestep into strikes more easily than many characters, basically. And since she's not generally playing heavy forward-moving offense anyway, she doesn't care basically at all. As long as she's maintaining the spacing she would prefer, you don't get to do anything, and she's literally set up to automatically dodge a ton of things you do. In fact, most interestingly, a lot of moves with longer startup that would normally hit characters in these situations. As a general rule in this game, the thing you should do is not flinch. What you need to do is more so to keep sidestepping, similar to how you can avoid certain moves in 2D games by just continuing to walk forward. Let's say you walked forward and your opponent jumped to cross you up, just keep walking forward. It's our standard to flinch and, oh wait, I must suddenly press back the other way, but that's what gets you crossed up in the first place. Similarly, if you're trying to get out of range of certain combos or combo moves or pressure, just walking backward is enough. If you're thinking, hey, I need to avoid this thing, no, you just walk backward entirely out of it, especially if it's like a throw. In small stages like this, it's harder for Helena to do, but more important that she do it. Because again, the number of things this gets her out of is spectacular. And if you're on the other side, extremely annoying. Of course, as with all things, you must recognize that whenever you feel sidestep isn't going to work here, it means that by nature something else must work. And coming to that conclusion in time is difficult, but at least you know it's logically sound every time. If the sidestep was not going to work because your opponent was likely to hit you first, you should probably be able to figure out which move they need to use in order to do this. It's basically the same thing. By removing all of the moves your opponent could use that would hit straight, i.e., okay, I'm sidestepping now, so your entire straight attack repertoire is gone. What do you have left, and what do I have to do to hold it?
Get ready. Fight!
Games are often about controlling your opponent's options in this way. But without this, Helena is hard to play because she's not actually good at stopping opponents from doing things. She's good at not being in the right space for it to work. She's also a character who is, therefore, really good at making sure she's never cornered. Which is extremely important for her playstyle because if she's cornered, she doesn't have enough space to set up situations she wants. You get her to the corner and she's automatically in trouble. But since she can avoid this a lot, she doesn't care as much. At the highest levels, you can get to the point of feeling the opponent's need to react, starting your sidestep and then immediately holding when they try. With your main weakness being characters with really long command grabs. It also minimizes the damage she takes, as you're easily seeing here. Many of the moves people need to use in order to prevent Helena from getting out of phase with sidestep just don't hit that hard.
Get ready. Fight!
This hasn't come up so much in this before, because honestly, of the opponents available for her to practice against, Kazuki Dynasty had mostly opponents that couldn't be sidestepped easily. It's relatively difficult to sidestep Elliot. Not difficult per se to sidestep Kasumi, but she has moves that you must react to by holding out of your own sidestep, and Ayane is that, but about doubly hard. Very spinny characters will just purposely whiff the first move and do the spinny part as the second move, and then you have to hold it. But since this is almost always a mid-kick, you don't really have that much to learn. It's important, but it's not crippling. You can pick it up over time, and the only reason I've taken so long to mention it is because, like with most things in fighting games, you'll frustrate yourself if you try to go up too many steps at once, because you're often trying to find a way to solve a problem that must be practiced and understood. If you try to understand a problem with 5 different pieces at once, you may find yourself overwhelmed and unable to figure out what you're doing wrong. So get good at something at the base level first until you could say at least with certainty, oh, I know why that didn't hit, or I know why I got hit there. And then you can add more things because you can compare your information better.
This is your last chance to run away.
Are you here to take me out?
Get ready. Fight!
background explanations. Literally, in the background explanations. Mainly because I didn't really want to add even more complexity to the stream. But apparently not background enough today. You heard nothing. More seriously, if you did hear much, you should probably look into exactly how all the side steps work in this game. But we're not going into that today.
I'm giving this all I got.
Are you here to take me out?
last chance to run away. I don't have time to play games with you.
Get ready. Fight! Get ready. Fight!
Are you ready? Sorry I missed your lovely singing.
I'm giving this all I got.
I don't have time to play games with you.
Honoka can be sidestepped a little closer to because of her issues with range. She's not a terribly short-range character, but most of her long-range stuff is in fact linear enough that Helena will get around it. The rest of it will do less damage, as with Paimon, meaning that the difficulty is more so deciding exactly what range to be at from Helena's side. Similar to the Paimon matchup, Helena's larger concern is staying toward the center of the arena and out of the corner situations, because once she does get closer to corners, Honoka's knockback moves become more powerful. One of the hardest things to get used to is actually being seen somewhat here. There are definitely situations in which it would seem as if the next best option is to strike at your opponent before they can move closer to you and pin you in the corner, but because Helena's sidestep is so strong, she can often, against at least a certain subset of the cast, simply reposition out of the corner instead in that scrambly situation. Right there, for example, there's enough space between the characters for Helena's sidestep to work out enough, forcing Honoka and similar characters to sidestep themselves in order to hopefully keep her back to the corner relative to their own position. It is this duality that actually allows Helena to land those attacks without getting whiff punished. Since if Helena launches a long attack, but Honoka or similar has decided to step away, she'll often get whiff punished right back into the wall or the corner. However, if they choose to back off in that moment, and she goes for the sidestep, she will often get out without them getting much benefit. The opponent must also often make a read on which way to sidestep for this to work.
Hey, no hard feelings.
I don't have time to play games with you.
Mila is not so much one of those characters where Helena gets a lot of options to get out of close range situations using her sidestep. But she's also not a character where the match changes a whole lot when Helena is cornered. Most of her knockbacks have such long stagger animations that it really doesn't matter to the Helena player overall, even with the Oki. If she's doing stuff from close range that is actually a threat, then most likely Helena doesn't care whether or not she's close to the corner or not. Putting that in perspective is fairly easy. It's a boxer in a boxing ring, but the entire reason that boxing rings aren't just a terrible idea and instantly unfair to the one who gets cornered or close is because despite it obviously being some advantage to have your opponent against the ropes, it's not terribly difficult to deal with. A lot of the time the ropes are more so to help the offensive boxer because without them it'd be too easy to outrange a ton of things without having to think about your footwork or where you're going to end up by backing off.
Oh, that spirit you had a moment ago.
is your last chance to run away.
Yeah, I'm here to fight.
Fight! Get ready! Fight!
Let's go! No, wait, let's go!
Get ready! Fight!
You were acting all tough at the beginning. What happened?
I'm giving this all I got. Hey, no hard feelings.
Learning a new character is always rough when facing anyone who has a decent idea of how to stop the main flows of any character. Once you're comfortable enough, even basic analysis will be enough to help you get through the idea of how you fight this character, which is why high-level players are often so scary when it comes to those things. They remain on top because whenever a new character is introduced to a game, everyone else goes, I don't get it, I don't know how I'm fighting this, what is this nonsense that's happening? But a lot of the time, they'll have broken it down at least, and have the mental space within the match to go, okay, well, I need to do this, and also know that, it doesn't work sometimes, so they're comfortable. It's harder to be comfortable from the side of the person playing the new character when all of the things you think are supposed to make the character strong end up feeling like they don't work. Because your mastery of them is not up to the level required to put them all together yet, and putting the things together in this way is often required to stress out the opponent enough for any of them to work. There are definitely some characters in fighting games that are completely ineffective until your opponent is stressed out, but you can't stress out your opponent until you've learned enough of how the pieces of their flow fit together. Mila is not quite that type of character. As demonstrated here, a lot of Mila's capacity is that she can, to some extent, just hit buttons. Your bigger problem has more to do with what happens to you in neutral than any issues with your pressure once close. Therefore, it suits Dewolf's spacing and timing sometimes, but it can often lead to an equally frustrating situation on the reverse, because it's hard to learn what to do when really the only thing that's deciding whether or not you're winning the match is how well your opponent can defend against the thing you're doing. One good way to tell actually lies in the same question of neutral. If you're playing Mila and never winning in neutral, then you're going to end up frustrated later. Because it generally implies that when you have managed to get in, it's because your opponent made some mistake or you got a little lucky. But every time your opponent is able to stop you from making much damage at that point and get back to neutral, you have to rely on the same thing happening again. This isn't to say one should be particularly discouraged by these types of outcomes when playing. After all, to play a character that gets to hit a lot of buttons and then be upset that your opponent gets stressed out and has difficulty, or just doesn't, i.e. that you're not really the main decider of whether or not you get to get damage at that point, isn't really helpful emotionally at all. After all, if your opponent could never do anything against you just hitting buttons and you would always fall for it, then it would be a fairly easy game and everyone would play that character, and we know this because this used to happen in certain fighting games and everyone played those characters and that was it. In fact, it's often something that happens at the beginning anyway. It's easy for many people to come to the conclusion that characters just get endless pressure, which tends toward people playing those characters, and the frustration of having to get good enough to block through or counter out of very tight strings can really weigh on certain people.
I don't have time to play games with you.
Alright. I will do my best.
Okay, Helena is no longer in the corner. But didn't put quite as much effort in putting Honika's back to the wall. Now we're in even more enclosed space. And the situation is likely to get more complicated as they go. One of Helena's main considerations is that once she has the center in a small arena, sidestepping can often feel like giving it up. But at the same time, you can't just not do it, because then you become predictable. Learning to read when you should sidestep in and then back out, and therefore when your opponent is likely to try to attack because they think you're going to change, is something you have to build up over time as well. But always remember that you don't specifically need to sidestep every moment, and you can definitely assume, once again, if you are really worried about your opponent attacking you and hitting you out of your sidesteps, then it means you're expecting your opponent to attack. What do you expect this attack to be? Characters with parries almost always have this as one of their strongest options in games, and therefore a game where everyone can parry and hold pushes this quite a bit higher up. If you have a full expectation of your opponent's intention, all you have to get right is their timing. In other games, normally this would mean that you would need to commit to an attack of your own, often one that carried you forward at least a little bit, or in some way caused the high potential of a whiff that your opponent could punish really strongly. But holds don't generally turn out like that, especially at mid to long range in this game. You can often just hold, and presuming you held when your opponent was not yet ready to attack, they're not necessarily reacting to the hold itself and still managing to hit you. A lot of the time, if you do this by holding the hold button when you execute the hold, your character will go straight into blocking afterward, and you won't have any problems. But that's just about enough information packed into this one stream. Given the flow, there's no specific reason the lounge is likely to end that soon. People may leave it, and it means if you want to get more matches of your own and didn't feel like waiting around for being cycled through, you're likely to get more matches if you join soonish, as there will be people who will be taking their leave. But as the lounge closes, when the lounge creator leaves it, you can be reasonably sure that that's not right away for our Helena, and you might see some more time, at least, from Ayane. This, however, is likely to be our last on-stream match of the night. Tomorrow, as usual, we have no content. Friday content will of course return when we have done either DOA bot development, which is again postponed mostly because DOA bots are not terribly helpful, specifically because you can't use them in facilitated matches, etc. So we'd have to create bots that were worth it, and since so many people are able to get through this game with just core fighters and not own characters beyond the main ones and the ones they play, you can definitely see somewhat less of it. The sort of person who is serious enough to buy the whole thing either has enough money that they probably have their own things to do, or is serious enough about the game that the type of bots we currently find ourselves able to create for this game don't really live up to their needs yet. We do have some in the works for it, but still working on them as they are still imperfect. Which means the next set of content you should be expecting on Fridays is actually the upcoming release of more characters for Street Fighter V. When that will actually happen, we don't really know, but we definitely know that they plan to make an announcement about it next week. And possibly to release tons of them at once, which is going to be kind of stressful on our bot creation, but not necessarily too much. they do tend to happen quite quickly. It's more so getting them all out on the site that tends to be hard. In Street Fighter terms, of course, you can join us next week Monday for another mishmashing battle lounge. More or less the same type of content as this, usually with the same duration as this. With the missing link being that it will be winner stays on because they don't give you another option. But this has been really in 142MK. You can find all our bots at 2-mk.org and all of our Twitter news and stream timings at 2_mk_FGC on Twitter. That's the end of another 60 Times segment. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.